Well, thank you for inviting us into your home, Ralph. It's a real pleasure and honour to be here talking to you on behalf of the Scottish Jazz Archive. And I wondered if we could start by you telling us just a little bit about where you got started with music, or with jazz specifically.
Well, my mother made me cringe often enough when I was a lad. I think the god of jazz prodded me when I was born. I'm told, I can't remember it, but at the age of about 2.5, my party trick was to toddle across to the gramophone in the corner of the sitting room and work through the stacks of 78s in cardboard sleeves until I came to Duke Ellington's Ring Dem Bells. And that was my party trick. And I got revenge on my mother by making her listen to it. What I do remember, before I went to school, when I was on my own, my favourite pastime was to stand on a brass coal box in the sitting room with a wooden knitting needle conducting music while you work. And my mother tells me too, they took me to the King's Theatre in Glasgow to see, it was a show or a pantomime, I can't remember. We were a few rows from the front, and when we finished, my mother said to me, do you know, you never looked at the stage all night, you watched the band the entire time. So I think I was destined for it. I must have been the youngest jazz record collector in Kilmarnock. I started collecting records when I was about 10. And they were quite expensive. They were 5 shillings each, which was money I didn't have. So I committed an act of apostasy or something. Today, I suppose I'm a card-carrying atheist, and I suppose my inclinations weren't too different back when I was 11. But my friend George McCall sang in the choir of the Kilmarnock Episcopalian Church, and he dropped it to me once that when they got booked for weddings, they got 5 shillings each. So I thought, you're on. How often do you do a wedding? He said, 1 or 2 a month. So I joined the Episcopalian choir and started my record collection. First record I ever bought was the 1933 Parlophone, the Eddie Condon band, The Ill and Home Cooking. That's been a favourite of mine ever since. I desperately wanted to play the trumpet. I went to piano lessons when I was about 10 or 11 for 4 or 5 years. Got on all right, ended up with the more difficult Chopin things like the C-sharp waltz and the A polonaise, but I didn't really enjoy it. I wanted to play the trumpet. So I just forgot all about these piano lessons. And my next act was Stuart Forbes, in your interview, has exactly the same background as me. He was brought up in Kilmarnock, went to Kilmarnock Academy, and he got himself started in the same way I did. The Kilmarnock Borough Band was run by a man called John Matheson, a dear, elderly, gnome-like man. And my folks couldn't afford a trumpet, so I joined the Kilmarnock Borough Band to get a free trumpet, like Stuart did. And poor Mr. Matheson gave me lessons. And I cringe to think how awful a pupil must have been. He tried to teach me the non-pressure system, which was a bit like farting against thunder, because all my heroes were people like Wild Bill Davison and Louis, who used the maximum pressure system. Anyway, shameful act, which I have been cringing about for the last 65 years or so. He taught me for 3 or 4 months, and my uncle won the pools and gave me enough money to buy a trumpet. So shame on me. I crept back up to Mr. Matheson's little flat and left my cornet outside his front door and scuttled off. And I've felt rotten about it ever since. So if you're up there in your cloud, Mr. Matheson, I'm sorry, and you were a good man. The next, I doodled to records, of course, like all musicians do. The next thing that happened, I think, was a Saturday in the summer of, I can't remember how old I was, I'd be 15, 16. And it was Glasgow University Rag Day. But for some unknown reason, they descended on Kilmarnock. And on the back of a lorry was a jazz band. And it sounded like the angelic choir to me. So I'll tell you who it was. It was George Ogilvy, the wonderful Maurice Rose, our greatest eccentric player ever, and Bob Nummy on trombone. I can't remember who the rhythm section was. And cocky little conceited bugger that I was. I don't know why I had my trumpet with me, but anyway, I did. And I got up on the lorry with them and sat down while they played and doodled. They were ever so kind. If it had been me, I'd have kicked my ass off the back. But they let me sit and doodle. And they played a dance that night, which I went to, and they kindly let me sit in for a number. And they also let sit in a trombone player who was wearing a Royal High School former pupil's rugby shirt. And that was George Hewitt, who has been my oldest musical friend. And George is still working away in Irvine. He's an unreconstituted New Orleans man, always has been, stuck to his guns all his life. And he still runs a New Orleans session at the Irvine Harbor Arts once a month. So he is the man I have known for longest in the music business, bless him. So we formed a band. And I'm going to pass over that because in George's memoirs, he describes all of that perfectly well. We were awful. Well, I was awful. We formed, first of all, the Ayrshire Jazz Band, whose only claim to fame is we were one of the first. And then that morphed into a band called the Eagle Jazzmen. George describes them well, who was in them, where we played, so I leave it entirely to read his memoirs. I'd only correct one thing. He said we came second last in the jazz band championships. I remember we came last. The weak link was me. My conceit at wanting to play the trumpet meant that I had chosen an instrument for which I wasn't well suited. I didn't have enough time to practice, or perhaps enough willpower, and my lip always went. And I was the weak link in all my bands. So anyway, I graduated and I went to America for a year on an exchange fellowship. St. Andrews and an Ivy League university called Union had an exchange program. And I went as an exchange fellow for a year. And I came back and went into the army. So that was 3 years away from music. And when I came out of the army, I joined Rolls-Royce in Derby and had my first musical epiphany. For once I was honest with myself and I said, Rolf, you're never going to be a good trumpet player. Pack it in. So I did, but moved to piano because piano players were fairly few and far between. And I was in the Midlands for 12 years, from 1961 to 63. And that time was really me reinventing myself and learning how to play band piano. I never wanted to be an Oscar Peterson. I wanted to be the best band pianist I could be. I admired people like Stan Gregg and Barney Bates and I spent several years just learning how to play like they did, or trying to do it anyway. Rolls-Royce interrupted my musical life as they kept bloody doing. They sent me off to university for a year to do a management degree. And when I came back from that, things started to happen. In mid-60s, let me think. I think three things happened. I started writing for Jazz Journal because I was pissed off at the non-musician critics. They do keep putting their foot in it, which shows that they don't understand the music at all. And the more conceited they are, the better they are at doing that. And I would sit with rage reading record reviews by people who didn't know what they're talking about. So I started reviewing records for Jazz Journal anyway. And I had a Saturday morning hours jazz record program on BBC Radio Derby. And the third thing was I formed a band. It was occasioned by a personnel manager being moved into a few offices away from me, with whom I became friendly, and it transpired that he had immediately on graduation gone straight into the Mike Cotton band. At the peak time, he did things like the Morecambe and Wise show and Ready, Steady, Go. And then he moved from there to the Bob Wallace band, who had 3 months at the London Palladium. And then, being a pragmatic, intelligent guy called Jerry Williams, he packed it in when he saw the trad scene evaporating and joined Rolls-Royce, put his clarinet in the attic. However, we started as friends, and I persuaded him after a while to get his clarinet down. And we formed a band. It was called Jazz Spectrum, and we did all right. The first thing was being at the program at Radio Derby. I'd got a wee bit of pull, so we did a couple of recording sessions for them, which they broadcast. And some guys were opening a jazz club on the north side of Derby monthly with name bands. And they asked us to go as the relief band, which we happily did. And Radio Derby would broadcast it live every month for 3 hours. It was nice, good publicity for the band. We got a residency at Mallory Park Racing track monthly. They had monthly meetings. Got a few orgiastic nights there in the clubhouse. Best of all, though, we were asked to go as a resident band at the Dancing Slipper. The Dancing Slipper was one of the main half dozen or so venues on the jazz circuit. Back in the days when there were 30 and 40 such venues in the circuit, there were still half a dozen that stuck out and lasted it. And by the time we were asked to go there, it was about 1967, 68, and there weren't too many bands. They booked every Saturday night. The Slipper had a name jazz group. But by the end, later in the 60s, there weren't so many bands for them to book. So the guy who ran it, Noel Jiggins, decided he would put a resident band in, us, and bring in a guest soloist every Saturday night. And that was great, because I got to play with and meet and be friends with just about everybody in the British jazz scene. Sandy did it several times. Humph did it several times. George Melly, Bruce Turner, but dozens of them, Al Gay, Betty Smith, Alan Elsdon. My failing memory, just about everybody. So I began to feel that my apprenticeship was pretty good. And in fact, it was sealed by, when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager anyway, my goal was not to sit in the Count Basie band when the Count Basie was ill, It was just to play at the 100 Club. And Jazz Spectrum got offered a gig at the 100 Club. So the end of my time in the Midlands, I felt I'd done my apprenticeship and I was beginning to get back on the road. But then the bloody company intervened and they sent me to Bristol. And I spent the next 18 years in Bristol. That's when I started to do some meaningful playing. First couple of years there, I did nothing. I was regretful of sabbatical because I had rather a difficult job to do. I kept writing for Jazz Journal. I'd been commissioned to do Billboard-owned Jazz Journal by now, and they'd commissioned me to do a book on a discographical book. Nothing to do with being a musician at all, just my historian side. So I worked on that for a couple of years. The Bristol scene was quite healthy. There were three groups that appealed to me. The Avon Cities were the prominent one. They were going continually from 1948, and this was now the mid-70s, with the same front line. Longest running band in the country. Good band, played interesting material, good arrangements by their trumpet player, Jeff Nichols, good rhythm section. Their clarinet player, Ray Bush, sang very well. And that was my favorite Southwest band. The other band was called the Blue Note Jazz Band, who got a lot of work because they were a jolly band. And the third group I liked the look of were three girls called Sweet Substitute, who were doing a sort of Boswell Sisters come Manhattan Transfer, really. Very impressive little trio. Anyway, I saw all that from a distance. The first person I got working with there was Keith Smith. Keith had been in Denmark, where he took his business, and he got to work for 2 or 3 years with Papa Bue's band, who were well-known continental band. And he'd got a hiatus hernia and sold up and came back to convalesce in Devon. And as he began to feel better, he discovered that Ian Wheeler, Chris Barber's clarinet player, had got scunnered with being on the road, and he was living only 5 or 6 miles away. So, of course, being jazzers, they got together and formed a band they called Hefty Jazz and asked me to join them. So that was the first playing I did down south. Keith went on, I think, to form the best Dixieland band after Alex Welch. He was wonderful people and a very clever man. He is much maligned in the jazz press, but I would disagree with that. I knew Keith for 25 years, and I never found him anything other than great company and a good guy to play with. Always paid on time, no problems whatsoever. Sat up till 4 o'clock in the morning, burning holes in the carpet. And he's got a bad reputation, I think, for 2 reasons. Firstly, he, I suppose, did monster up like a lot of people do. And he made the mistake of monstering up with a critic called Steve Vos. And when Keith died, Steve did an unpardonable thing. He wrote an obituary which began, "Keith Smith was the most unpleasant man I have ever met in my life." Now, you don't do that, even if you don't like somebody in an obituary. Anyway, that, of course, got huge publicity. The second thing was 3 of his ex-players took him to court for payment of money, which was probably quite genuine because Keith was never mean, but he was never very thoughtful either. So these 2 things together have given him a bad reputation. But the fact remains he was one of the best trumpet players we've ever had. And cleverer than that, he invented a way to keep jazz on the road in the 1980s when no jazz was on the road. I'll talk a bit about that later. Anyway, I started playing with Keith. He didn't have a lot of work living in Devon. We did a broadcast on Plymouth Sound for an hour. We did a concert with Billy Butterfield, did a 4-day tour with George Chisholm, and other pub gigs. And I felt I was getting back in the stream again. Keith left Devon and moved to Oxford late 70s sometime. But by that time, I'd been asked to join the Blue Notes. We're a good band to play with. They didn't have a trumpet. They were led by a soprano sax player, Roger Bennett, who had the Terry Wogan spot on Radio Bristol at 8 o'clock every morning. He was a powerful player, and he took the place of the trumpet. We got a lot of work, cut an album. I said earlier about how I came to do reviews because I was pissed off at non-musicians giving musical opinions and record reviews. The doyen of jazz discographers was a man called Brian Rust. He's the king emperor of all discography and did a mammoth amount of work for jazz. But he had his ears painted on. John R.T. Davis, another discographer, once told me that Rust had discovered an unknown record, and he didn't know who the band was, and he didn't know who the trumpet player was, and could John R.T. have a listen, and could they work out who it was? Now, it was a dreadful record made in the early days by Fletcher Henderson, except 2/3 of the way through, for 16 bars, is Louis. And to me, it's like what jazz did to music. You listen to it and it's just awful. And then this ethereal trumpet comes in. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. Anyway, John R.T. listened to it and he said to Brian, he said, well, who do you think it is? And Brian said, I don't know, I thought it might be Bix Beiderbecke. So that shows you that Brian Rust, although a great discographer, had no musical ear. I'm mentioning this because we cut an album with the Blue Notes, which Brian Rust reviewed in the Gramophone, the monthly magazine. And his review began, there has been nothing like this band in the history of jazz. I thought, Christ, what's he going to say, you know, out of tune and don't play. However, he went on to be really quite complimentary about it. And come the end of the year, would you believe he picked it as one of his records of the year? So that was great publicity. It was a load of hyperbole. It's not a bad wee album. But at the same time, I cut another album with Keith Smith. Keith had a record label called Hefty Jazz. And he admired a clarinet player called Sammy Remington, who was a New Orleans man. He was playing with Chris Barber at the time. And Smithy thought that there was more in him than his George Lewis style led him to play. So he wanted to stretch him. So he commissioned a date with his rhythm section with me and Ian Wheeler, who was about to go back to join Barber when the other clarinet player, Sammy Remington, left. So it was a 2-clarinet, 2-reed album called Read All About It. That sold quite well, and bits of it I quite like, bits of it I shudder with shame at, but bits of it are all right. The Blue Notes, they started a monthly concert with visiting Americans. And that was marvelous as well. So for about 18 months, we played monthly with Bob Masters was managing most of them at the time. Let me see, who did they put through us? Reed's Peanut Tucko, Bob Wilbur, Bud Freeman, Buddy Tate, Brass, let me see, Ruby Braff, Wild Bill, Piano Ralph Sutton and Dick Wellstood. Anyway, these guys, and it was marvellous playing with you. It was the first time I'd played with Americans, and it taught me a hell of a lot. Jerry Williams had taught me a lot in Jazz Spectrum as well. His time as a pro, he passed on all sorts of useful, not just how to stand on the stage and how to try and get an audience on your side, but he taught me how to rehearse as well. So anyway, by the end of, I must tell you, about this time, I fell out with Rolls-Royce and left 1981. And just before I left, the Farnborough Air Show. Farnborough's a great hoolie for everybody in the aerospace industry. Massive, great central exhibition centre surrounded by chalets. And the real work goes on in the chalets at Farnborough, where you schmooze and whatever they call it, network. And I was in charge of purchasing at the time, so I had to go to Farnborough and schmooze. But I had a favourite chalet. The chalets were all quite high-powered. They all brought in caterers and they all tried to outdo each other. But a relatively small company had the most wonderful chalet in Farnborough. They were called Mal Tools. They were a smallish company in North Lancashire owned by a gigantic American conglomerate who owned Columbia Pictures and all sorts. Anyway, they had endless money. And they sent their American PR guy over to run their chalet at Farnborough. We got on quite well. He's called Skip Cundle. And I used to go there for a coffee first thing in the morning. And my first or second day there, Skip said, "You play, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You couldn't find me a Dixieland band, could you? I'm thinking of having a party on Thursday after the air show." So yeah, I'll see what I can do. So I rang Smithy, and he said, "Yeah, you're not doing it. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Who's working at 4 o'clock in the afternoon?" So he agreed to bring his band down with me on piano. So sure enough, the next day, the band appeared at 4 o'clock. Ron Hetherington set up his drums. Harvey plugged in his bass. Mickey Cook tuned up his trombone. Keith tuned up his trumpet. And Ron Drake was playing clarinet and tenor. And as they were tuning up, Skip arrived with a crate, a large crate, which he plunked down in front of the band. Said, "You guys can have this." And we opened it, and it was 12 bottles of champagne. So rather dangerous. However, we got going, and it was a happy band, and it was a happy sound, and the place was stocious, absolutely fleeing. Everybody was having a great time, clapping each other on the back, drinking. I remember at one interval I saw Ron Hetherington with his hand up the back of the inside of a blouse of a fairly smart-looking lady who it transpired was the wife of the vice president of procurement for the Boeing Aircraft Corporation. Another table at the corner, there were 3 guys in RAF uniforms arm wrestling with 2 of the 3 chalet hostesses egging them on. Anyway, we went back in the stand. Keith actually went to sleep before the last number, but it was a great success. And we staggered out. Even I had a few drinks, and I don't drink. we staggered out, and I remember there was a Rolls Royce parked close by with a pool of vomit on the bonnet. Anyway, next day, I found out that the air show had cancelled the Air Red Devils display because they hadn't passed their physical test that morning. They were the three guys who were getting pissed at our party. So that might be all a bit career limiting. Anyway, that was, the guys always remember that. So I left Rolls-Royce. Number of reasons. At the back of it all, I wanted to spend more time in music. By now I was about 45, and I felt that I really wanted to do more musical, and all this working during the day was only to make up enough money to enjoy your leisure time. So I was still working with the Blue Notes when I left, but the next thing that happened was that I'd sent an LP of the Blue Notes and an LP of the Avon Cities to Mike Hart to see if he might want to use them on the pub trail. And Mike rang or wrote back and said yes. To my surprise, he didn't pick the Avons, he picked the Blue Notes. So I said, yeah, fine, I'll ask them. So I went rather feeling like Santa Claus with a bag of goodies. I thought, oh, they'll be dead chuffed at this. But they declined. There's a certain xenophobia in the Southwest. And I think they never travelled very far unless they were flown. Anyway, they turned it down. So I thought, well, there's an opportunity here. I didn't know Al Fairweather all that well. I'd known Sandy, I'd known Al since the early days, but only to nod to and chat with. Al, this would be 1982, I think, and Al had packed in playing in 1969, 13 years before. He got scunnered with being on the road. He was on the road 4 or 5 years with Acker. So he packed it in and started school teaching art, which was sad because Al was a shy man and he hated teaching. It must have been pure hell for him when you're shy in teaching. He had a sad life, did Al. He divorced his first wife. They had a couple of kids, but she was a singer called Pam Hegren, and they didn't get on well. Pam was a party girl. Then he married a second girl called Judy, who was a habitué of the 100 Club, a well-known face. Nice girl, good fun. He married her and he had 2 sons by her. And when the first son was 6 years old, he complained of a pain in his left eye. And they diagnosed cancer, had to take the eye out. And God, the next year, they had to take the other eye out as well. So poor Ali was left profoundly blind. And the second son, James, was hyper and was hardly controllable. Then Judy got multiple sclerosis. So Al was carrying all this load around while doing a job he hated. I didn't know this at the time, but I rang him up and said, are you still playing? He said, oh, a bit. He said, not much. I said, how'd you like to come up to Edinburgh for a week? And he said, yeah, great. So I put a band together to go around Al. It was mainly Smithy's band. Mickey Cook was on trombone. The Jackie Graham of Bristol, a guy called Nick Cooper, was the clarinet and alto player. The rhythm section was Smithy's, really, Harvey Weston and Tony Allen. It was a good little band, and Wayne Chandler was on guitar. And I was a bit trepidated about it because I didn't know how Al was going to be. I'd got a bunch of pros. I've never actually led a band with pros in it before. I'd fixed a gig the night before the pub trail started up somewhere near Perth. And we all met there. And I was really very, very trepidated. But we got going and it was fine. Everybody relaxed. And we had a great week. It was great fun. Enjoyed every gig. And at the end of it, one of the nicest things that ever happened to me in jazz, at the end of the pub trail, I'd booked one last gig, which was at George Hewitt's place in Irvine at the Harbour Arts Centre. And we went over there, and halfway through, the guys presented me with a book, which they'd all written, "Thanks for a great week." So that gave me a bit of courage to do things. And we kept that band going. We brought it back up for a tour the following Easter. And we did the 100 Club, did a broadcast on radio too, did the Jazz Cafe in London, a few other things. Then Al had a heart attack. So that put that on the back burner. I've been thinking since I retired, what do I really want to do? And what I really wanted to do was something that would bring the paying public back to jazz. I was getting sadder and sadder that the jazz audience was disappearing. Smithy had done a great thing to help that. He started his full-time band in the late 70s when there wasn't much work for bands at all, so he invented how to do it. And it's an object lesson to anybody else who wants to do the same. He decided he had to not play jazz clubs, he had to play theatres. Theatres still had money and were booking. He decided that what he needed to do was to have a name that the public knew, who was not inimical to jazz and who could fit in all right. Elkie Brooks, Helen Shapiro, Alison Moyer, that sort of person. Preferably something else on the bill, and a band that never used the word jazz. So I helped him put the show together. It was called The Stardust Road, the music of Hoagie Carmichael, and he booked Georgie Fame, genius. The music of Hoagie Carmichael with Georgie Fame, and he got the Sweet Substitute girls in as well. Sweet Substitute, Keith Smith and his band. And the genius thing was, he didn't have a band, he didn't have a show, but he printed posters and flyers. And he hired a girl who sent one to every theatre in the country. And then followed it up 3 weeks later with a telephone call. And out of it, he started to book this show round British theatres. And, you know, it went on to do 520 theatre performances. It was a pure jazz show, okay, staged, but it was excellent jazz, and the audience loved it. So I thought that's how to do it. Now, I didn't have a band, so I wanted to do something similar. So I invented Groove Juice. Or to be honest with you, it was Ray Bush, the clarinet player with the Avons, and John Scouse, the trombone player with the Blue Notes, who helped me invent it. We were sitting around one night, feeling no pain, and we decided that one of our favorite times in jazz was the 30s, 40s, with all the hip stuff, with Saturday Night Fish Fry and the Louis Jordans and the Straighten Up and Fly Right and the booting tenor players. And so we thought we'd put a band together for fun to do that sort of thing. And I wrote a few arrangements, and we had a quick rehearsal, and we did a gig at The Bristol jazz pub was called the Old Duke, which had jazz 7 nights a week on Sunday lunchtimes, and we premiered the band at the Duke Sunday lunchtime. And again, the audience went wild. It was one of the most gratifying things I've ever seen. And I had a tenor player in the band that I'd asked, who was a pure modernist, but I wanted a good booting tenor player, and I was a bit worried about whether he wouldn't like the music. But at the end of that first gig, he said, you know, Rolf, you've got something here, we should do something with it. So I thought, that's worked as well. I was always inspired by the way Basie played basic chordal jazz, but was able to meld into it people like Eddie Lockjaw Davis. And it was a marvelous marriage, always worked well. So anyway, Groove Juice was born. We had some luck. We very quickly got a lot of Radio 2 work. That was a big help. Bristol was a regional centre for jazz, for the BBC, and got a quota for doing recordings. And in those days, the quota was quite reasonable. They could do maybe 4 or 5 recording sessions a month. These were necessary because of a thing called needle time. The most appalling restrictive practice, I hate restrictive practices, except for this one, which was absolutely super for musicians. The Musicians' Union had held the BBC to ransom and had worked out a marvellous deal, whereby the BBC couldn't use records for more than a certain percentage of the time in their music programmes. And the rest of the time it had to be filled by music that the BBC produced. So they commissioned these 3-hour recording sessions. You went in for 3 hours, you did 8 numbers without mistakes, and that was it. They cut them up and used them in their nightly broadcasts. Night Ride, You and the Night and the Music, Charlie Chester Show, Angela Rippon Show, all that stuff. So anyway, we got booked for quite a few of those, and that got the band's name around. The next good thing was we got a Dutch festival, our first Dutch festival, and while we were there, an agent came and asked, could he represent us? And that was a good start because that gave us an excellent entree to the continent. The third thing that happened, which was a real blessing, was Southern Comfort, the drinks company, asked if they could sponsor us. And that was marvellous as well. They were very, very good sponsors. They produced music stands for us, which were works of a carpenter's art. They could have been done in mahogany with a... the only problem was they weighed a ton, and the band hated them. Anyway, what can I tell you about Groove Juice? Considering it was the 1980s, I think we got more work than we deserved, or that jazz was stalling out at the time anyway. We did literally dozens of Dutch and German festivals. We were rarely a month when we weren't across there. We did the Edinburgh Jazz Festival, of course, did the Glasgow Jazz Festival. We cut 3 albums. There, I've run out.
It's good going, though. I'm trying to think what to ask you next, but that we haven't covered, really. Should we go a bit esoteric and say, what do you think jazz has meant for you through your life? Has it been a static, stable kind of a relationship with jazz, or has it changed over the years?
Not really. I was born to be an evangelist for jazz. I just love jazz. and I felt everybody should love it. It's the greatest music that God ever put on earth, and I don't understand why it's not more popular, and it should be. And I've had that driving force all my life. When I started, there weren't categories. The days of the 78, you listened to everything. Not that there was much modern jazz around at the time, but I listened to New Orleans and swing and jazz piano and modern jazz quartet, everything. And I loved it all. In my early days, like most teenagers, I listened to the classic Louis Armstrongs and Jelly Roll Mortons and wanted to emulate that. But from then on, well, what do I play when I get in at home? I play rhapsodic tenor players. I like people like Ike Quebec and Eddie Lockjaw Davis, Jimmy Forrest, Arnett Cobb, that sort of music. And it's always been the same. So you say, what does it mean to me? It means that I've failed, but I hope others won't, in getting it back into the public consciousness.